This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, markets across the globe are extending gains today. That's amid rising hopes of a coordinated move from central banks to ease the impact of the coronavirus outbreak. Now, emerging market stocks across the board were comfortably in the black today. MSCI's index of developing market stocks was up about 1%. South Africa's JSE climbed over 2% on the day as sentiment improved. However, in South Africa, markets are still watching the release of domestic data that, of course, is expected to show the economy had slipped into a recession. All that coming up during the show, but for now, here's a look at what else is coming up. African nations scale up the fight against the coronavirus epidemic as more cases are reported. South Africa slides back into recession for a second time in 2 years. And what may look like dirt to you transforms into an eco-friendly fashion statement in Nigeria. Well, we begin tonight's show in Nigeria, where authorities have embarked on a sensitization campaign about the coronavirus. Over 40 people who came into contact with an Italian man who tested positive for the virus have also been quarantined. And as CGTN's Deji Badmus reports, the fight against unverified information is proving as important as the fight against the virus itself.
It's business as usual in Lagos, just days after the government confirmed Nigeria's first case of the coronavirus. The government had called for calm and giving everyone the assurance it was on top of the situation. It appears that message has sunk in, as there's no air of panic in the city. But people are careful and quite aware about the basics of the virus.
The most important thing is if you see anybody coughing and sneezing, preferably ensure to either stay away or report to the authorities so that they could test the person and, if possible, quarantine the person. That's just the way I'm looking at this.
Some organizations are taking precautions. The local Catholic Church here has stopped a traditional handshaking during Mass and cut down on some church activities. Most offices now have hand sanitizers at their reception desk, and the authorities continue to provide frequent updates on the index case.
There is no new confirmed case in Nigeria. About 13 or 14 tests have been done, and except that one patient, no other person has been diagnosed. There were 156 passengers on the manifest of the flight that brought the index case. Port Health Services and NCDC have been supporting both Lagos and Ogun State governments to carry out contact tracing and other response activities. Currently, the contacts of the index case are identified as 19 contacts in Lagos, 39 contacts in Ogun State. We are in touch with these contacts who are under supervised self-isolation.
Among the challenges authorities are now having to confront is fake news and, of course, misinformation. And there have been a lot of them over the past few days.
We must be careful what we listen to and what we believe on social media. Let us stay focused on what the government is saying, on what Nigeria Center for Disease Control is saying, on what the federal government is saying, and let that be the information we should take seriously.
The government is now ramping up its enlightenment campaign about the coronavirus on various media platforms. Local TV and radio stations have gone heavy on it. The dosage of information coming out of the local media space is now massive. The government is hoping all of this would make the difference in the country's quest to ensure COVID-19 does not spread beyond the single imported index case it currently has. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Meanwhile, the World Health Organization has praised Egypt's fast preparation to handle any COVID-19 cases. Since the outbreak was announced, key prevention measures have been implemented at Cairo's airport and other entry points. Now, the country is also evacuating Egyptians from Wuhan and relocated them to a domestic quarantine facility. One of those Egyptians spoke to CGTN's Adel El Mahoui about his experience and the preparedness level he's witnessed in Egypt.
Luckily for Egypt, half of its residents in Wuhan are graduate students in Huazhong Agriculture University. They are all aware about animal disease and epidemics. When Cairo decided to bring them home in a quarantine facility, they've all been taking professional steps to keep themselves safe. Mohammed Zaki was one of those quarantined.
The entire medical team in the quarantine hospital, where Egypt's medical crisis team specialized in epidemics and protective medicine. At first, they were very afraid of us. The nurses and the doctors kept a distance of 1 meter. Masks were always on. They were very cautious in dealing with us. After time, their tension dissolved, but they were still cautious.
For 14 days, they've stayed in a hospital remotely located near the western borders of Egypt, specially equipped to receive COVID-19 cases. They were the first time Egypt's medical caliber faced the risk of the virus. Fathi says when the first case was confirmed, the tight measures taken became stricter.
When a confirmed case was announced and moved to the hospital, they've taken tougher measures. They've prohibited our outdoors time, dedicated to get fresh air and go jogging. We've seen an ideal quarantine facility. If they weren't, we were prepared to take our own measures. Some of our colleagues have self-isolated themselves for 3 to 4 days afterwards, just to be safe.
Safely out and uninfected, Fathi is now eager to go back to Wuhan so he can complete his PhD research.
I can't wait to go back to China. I am impatiently waiting for the authorities there to gradually open the return. I know it will be soon. They're doing a great job there.
To date, none of the Egyptians from Wuhan has reported any symptoms of the virus. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Well, let's now delve further into the effects of the coronavirus on African markets. We're joined by Michael Sudar-Kassa. He is the Chief Executive Officer at Africa Business Group. Great to have you on the show with us today, sir. Now, we're not quite sure yet to what extent African nations will have to battle the virus in their own countries, given the low numbers the continent is currently seeing. Briefly, what are the biggest worries and threats for African governments right now? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the biggest threat that African governments have is the fact that we don't know as much as we'd like to know about the virus. So you're right that the cases on the continent have been very few. That's actually puzzled both African and non-African scientists to know why the uptake. I mean, it's a positive thing, but I think the bigger impact is the fact that China is a major trading and investment partner of the continent. And almost all things China seem to have screeched to a halt over the last month. So if you are looking to export products to China, that may not be happening at the rate that you'd like. If you need components for your value chain from China, those parts are delayed. And that's really had the knock-on. Travel, for example, has really taken a hit, both for business and for leisure and tourism. So it's the economic knock-on that I think has governments most concerned. And the fact that while the cases of new instances in China has decreased, the go-ahead really to open up the country has not been given, and no one really knows how long that will take.
You're quite right. China is one of Africa's biggest buyers. So let's hone into that point. Of course, that means falling Chinese demand in the wake of this outbreak is certainly bound to have an impact on the continent. So what are your thoughts on the extent of the impact it will have on African economies going forward?
Well, I think across the board, the projections for 2020 GDP growth on the continent have been scaled down. Many of the countries, particularly in Southern Africa, are natural mineral resource producers, companies in the oil and gas sector. All of them are really having to reevaluate what 2020 will look like. In West Africa, I was reading there's a major infrastructure project that had been allocated to Chinese contractors that's been halted because there's concern about the workers actually potentially infecting others. So it definitely, in the infrastructure space, in the oil and gas space, and the mineral space, China also, as I mentioned, are major tourists to the continent. Here in South Africa, there's a major decline, if you will. Broadly speaking, the mice industry is getting a setback because, again, beyond China, many other places in the world now have the virus. So people are just a bit skittish about bringing together people from all over the world for things that in the past they would take for granted and happily do. So it's having a negative impact, hopefully, because, again, the word in terms of following news is that there is the beginning of tests for treatment and vaccination. So we're hopeful, but in the interim, it's definitely a tense time around the continent.
Right. And as you mentioned, it's not just a China problem, the spread of the virus right now. And as a result, we've seen financial markets globally responding or falling quite heavily as a result of the spread of this virus. They're now adjusting, they're repricing assets. Investor sentiment seems to be soaring, especially towards emerging markets. So how are we seeing this impact Africa's currencies, Africa's equities, and of course, African assets?
Well, it's not going to be good. One of the challenges that the continent has is that the markets in the West really took a hit last week. They're somewhat rebounding, as you said, trying to price in for risk. But on the continent, currencies, in South Africa, for example, in December, the currency was 14 Rand to $1. It almost touched 15.5 yesterday. So it's going down. And in the fact that it's going down, we talked about the fact that we're slipping into a recession. The challenge with South Africa doing poorly, Nigeria is not doing as well as we like, is that these countries are regional drivers of economic growth. And so as they are laggard, the whole region has a cold, if you will, no puns intended. So it's going to be a trying year for the many different reasons, but particularly the virus is kind of continuing to slow things down. And the fact that China, who has been a catalyst for the continent for over a decade, will see its economy slow, it has a knock-on effect.
Now, do you think this recent outbreak will impact Chinese and other foreign trade deals with Africa going forward?
I really don't think that long-term, this season, if you will negatively impact China-Africa relations. I do think that, though, in the next 12 months, even if tomorrow a cure was found, there'll be more caution. But I don't think, given the amount of investment, the amount of loans that have been given from China, the volume of trade that exists, that countries will just decide, no, I'm not going to engage with China. But major infrastructure projects will be slowed. Trade in the commodities sector will be slowed. Agricultural sector will be slowed right now for the foreseeable future.
All right. Well, we're certainly watching. Many thanks for your insights. That was Michael Sudarkasa. He's the CEO at Africa Business Group. Now, of course, a little later on in the show, we'll bring you more stories on how China continues to strive in the face of the coronavirus epidemic. Well, let's now take a look at our corporate headlines today. South African trade unions expect a plan proposing to save Eskom from its debt burden to be ready within weeks. Now, the Labour Group, an ally of the ruling African National Congress, has proposed using the state pension fund manager, the Public Investment Corporation, and government-owned development finance institutions to cut the power utilities debt by $16.3 billion. And Somalia has agreed on an initial roadmap with a Shell and Exxon joint venture to explore and develop potential offshore oil and gas reserves. In October, Shell and Mobil, which had a joint venture on 5 offshore blocks in Somalia prior to the toppling of dictator Mohamed Siad Barre in the early 1990s, agreed to pay the government $1.7 million for a historic leasing of the blocks. And Visa Incorporated is working with 3 banks in Sudan to introduce its payment products. The firm is the latest Western brand seeking to enter the North African nation after the lifting of U.S. sanctions and the overthrow of its longtime dictator. Sources with the company say that Sudan's first Visa cards may be available within a month, with only minor technical issues still to be resolved. And Kenya's top retailer, including Naivas and Tuskys, have warned that the prices of consumer goods, such as clothing, furniture, mobile phones, TVs and fridges, will rise this month as effects of the global coronavirus epidemic take a toll on the supply chain. The retailers, who had shipped in goods in bulk ahead of the Chinese New Year in January, reckon that they will start to run out of goods from China in about 3 weeks. And that is a look at our corporate headlines. Well, we are heading into a quick break now, still to come. South Africa slides back into recession for a second time in 2 years. And the locust invasion hits 24 districts in Uganda.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business, only on CGTN.
2020 is said to be an eventful year for African economies. The continent of over 1.2 billion people is on the verge of creating the world's largest free trade area by membership. But the rules of trade are yet to be finalized, and it remains to be seen what industries countries will and will not protect. So what does the private sector need to thrive in an era where trade disputes keep rising at home and abroad? These issues and plenty more will be debated in the 2020 edition of the Africa CEO Forum. Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra Nairobi. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business. Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN. Welcome back. Let's head to South Africa now. The country is in a recession again. Data released by the country's statistical agency shows the economy contracted by 1.4% in the fourth quarter of 2019. Now, this follows a revised 0.8% contraction in the third quarter of the same year. That marks 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, signaling an economic recession in just 2 years. CGTN Sumitra Naidu has the details.
The South African economy is in an even poorer state than previously thought. Many are not surprised that the economy is in recession, but they are shocked by the bigger than expected contraction in these latest GDP figures. The general consensus was for a 0.2% contraction in the fourth quarter of 2019.
The size of the impact was bigger than we had thought. And now looking into like 2020, expectations are for a sub 1% growth rate for 2020. Unfortunately, the way things are going, both with the coronaviruses as well as the more than expected fall we saw in the end of 2019, it could be that we might even have difficulty maintaining a positive number for 2020 as well.
This means that the economy grew by a mere 0.2% in 2019. The Reserve Bank and the Treasury were expecting growth of at least 0.5%. 7 of the 10 main sectors of the economy contracted. Agriculture suffered the worst decline of 7.6% in the fourth quarter. Load shedding was the main contributing factor to declines in manufacturing, construction and retail.
The critical areas which we believe could drive this growth were transport, which went down tremendously, and construction, where non-skilled, labor-intensive workers do participate, has been declining in South Africa for 6 consecutive quarters, signifying to us that not only is South Africa in a deep economic crisis, but is going to see itself facing huge social problems because of the swelling number of the unemployed, particularly those that are low-skilled, that continue to lose opportunities in the retail as well as construction sectors.
The situation is unlikely to get better anytime soon. There's more load shedding on the cards at least for another year. The impact of the coronavirus is also being felt, and there's a critical ratings decision expected later this month.
South Africa could be junk status. There is no prospect for growth going forward. So really, for Moody's to come up with another excuse of allowing us to buy time when there's no concrete plan that's convincing, I think they'll be losing credibility. In
2020, growth rates are currently forecast at 0.7%. Unfortunately, looking at what's happening with coronaviruses, I think that we'll have real difficulty trying to maintain even that 0.7% target for this year.
It's hoped government will come up with an urgent plan to arrest the decline. In the meantime, the Reserve Bank is being urged to cut rates aggressively to spur consumption. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
In the meantime, South Africa's Royal Bafokeng Platinum has more than doubled its headline earnings for the year ending in December 31st, 2019. Now, the growth is attributed to a surge in Palladium, which hit a record of $1,900 an ounce in the period. Increasingly, stricter emission control legislation is driving the demand for the commodity. So what's driven Palladium to record price after record price? Well, Peter Major is the mining director at Mergence Corporate Solutions. He's live in Johannesburg tonight. Great to have you on the show with us, sir. Let's start with the basics. What makes Palladium so valuable? And of course, which country has the highest proven reserves?
Boy, it's a toss-up between South Africa and Russia. But in the end, South Africa is going to win. We have more platinum reserves that have palladium with them than we even have gold reserves. But Russia's palladium ore is much higher grade. So if they produce a ton of rock, they get almost half an ounce of palladium. We have to produce 4 tons of rock to get that much. But South Africa is very lucky. We are endowed with 80% of the known platinum resources and close to that in palladium. Currently, we're producing as much per year as Russia. I think we're both producing close to 4 million ounces a year.
Now, what exactly is driving
what makes it so valuable?
Right. Go ahead, Mr. Major.
Yeah, what makes it so valuable now and what's driving it? Auto catalysts. Over 90% of the palladium mined today goes into auto catalysts. And while people used to use platinum, the platinum price got so high, it got all the way up to $2,000 an ounce, $2,200 like palladium now is. Back then, this is 10 years ago, palladium was selling for $300-400 an ounce and platinum was selling for $2,000. So the auto manufacturers said, let's substitute, and they started using more and more palladium. They did all their research and development and engineering based on palladium. Now the roles are reversed. Now palladium is trading at $2,600 an ounce, and platinum is trading at $850, $900. And they're afraid to start switching back to platinum because then maybe palladium falls again. So it's almost damned if you do it, damned if you don't. But even higher than the palladium price is rhodium, which is now just under $13,000 an ounce. And so when we mine our rock, we used to call it platinum ore. It's actually rhodium ore. That's almost 40% of the value. Palladium is about 25 to 30% of the value, and platinum's down to about 15% of the value. So it's amazing how these three metals have shifted in the last 2 years.
Well, speaking of platinum, we've seen shares of platinum mining firms rising sharply over the second half of 2019. For example, Amplat's share price 50% higher over the last 12 months. What's likely to pull the rug from under this commodity going forward?
What'll pull the rug out really quick is if there's a fall in the rhodium and or palladium price. And we've seen rhodium prices almost this high 2-3 times in the last 20 years. It shoots up, it lasts a couple months, and it shoots down just as fast. We've seen palladium rise, not quite this far, but almost a couple times in the last 20 years. So what can pull the rug out from under them? EVs, electric vehicles. Because if the world keeps increasing going towards electric vehicles, there's not going to be need for palladium like there is now because they're not going to have petrol engines. And we saw that with platinum. The platinum price is up to $2,000 an ounce 10 years ago because people were going to diesel because diesel was more efficient. But now we find out it's harder to clean up diesel. And so people are going away from diesel. They're producing less diesel cars, so the platinum price fell, and they're producing more petrol cars, so the palladium price goes up. But if production of the petrol cars starts leveling off, starts falling, and gets replaced by electrical vehicles, then this demand for palladium could fall very quickly. And we don't know how much of this demand currently is being pushed up just by the auto manufacturers or by speculators, hedge fund managers, and maybe some others in between. It looks too scary to just be automotive demand.
And of course,
legislation. They changed the legislation a little bit.
Go ahead, Mr. Major.
I was going to say, if they change the legislation a little bit, like when George Bush Jr. was president, and the auto manufacturers are complaining they could not meet the California standards. And California is the biggest, richest state, was buying most of the cars. And the White House overruled the California legislature and said it's not necessary for Detroit to meet your requirements. Boy, all of a sudden you saw the palladium price just fall. Platinum came off because that all of a sudden bought them some time. So we could have legislation change in Beijing or in Europe or the States. It can change at the whim, and all of a sudden people don't have to meet the real stringent air quality requirements they have to right now. So when you have these kind of sky-high prices, they're very vulnerable to any little change, legislative or a replacement. You know, we've seen that with lithium batteries. You know, Elon Musk is now pushing to develop batteries without lithium, batteries without cobalt. You know, the cobalt price went crazy. Everybody thought they were dependent on the Congo. Now there's other manufacturers saying we think we can produce lithium batteries without cobalt. And eventually lithium could get replaced as well. So there's always a replacement. There's always a mad scientist in a basement somewhere working on an alternative.
Right. And of course, as you said, depending on legislation and assuming that electric vehicles gradually displace fossil fuel cars going forward, it all depends on these factors. So what are your thoughts on what's going to replace? Could it be cobalt going forward then? You talked about lithium as well. What is your outlook?
Look, we're also talking about hydrogen cars. Hydrogen is a very clean burning fuel that has no emissions other than some water vapor. And BMW was putting billions into a hydrogen car. Now, hydrogen cars do require platinum. They don't need palladium though. So even that can detract from the current demand. I would hate to forecast, but as Chris Griffiths of Amplat said, you don't have to guess what commodity is going to be in the most demand. If you're buying our shares, if you're buying a South African platinum share, you're really buying a South African PGM, platinum group metal share. Because when they mine a ton of rock, they're getting all three metals in it. And if the prices stay anywhere close to where they are now, these shares have a lot more growth in them. They're generating huge earnings that aren't even reflected in today's prices. Those earnings that were just declared the last few weeks, they were based on prices at the close of last year. Prices are already higher across the board than they were at the end of last year. So for investors, their fund managers should be buying the shares instead of banking on which metal's going to go up, I would think.
Quite interesting. Well, many thanks for your insights there, Mr. Major. That, of course, is Peter Major, Mining Director at Mergence Corporate Solutions. Well, let's shift focus now. The Ugandan government says desert locusts have invaded 24 districts, and that's despite efforts to wipe them out. The country's Ministry of Agriculture has initiated efforts to minimize the impact on food security in the affected districts. A wide range of pesticides have been used, and ground control operations have been conducted in all these 24 districts. Now, ground spraying has also helped suppress the mature swarms as it targets the locust eggs. Now, Uganda's Agriculture Ministry says the country may lose up to $218 million in export revenue, but that's if the desert locusts are not halted in the coming weeks. Well, let's get more on the extent of the damage so far. We're joined now by Ulrika Blom, Uganda's country director for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Great to have you on the show with us, Ulrika. Now, it has been said, or rather say you said, that a humanitarian catastrophe is looming in the region, and that's if funding to tackle this locust invasion isn't secured now. Briefly explain to us what your thoughts are on the extent of this threat.
Well, the locusts are quite new here into Uganda, but has been roaming around in large swarms in the region, and we know that around 20 million people are affected about this and in severe food insecurity in the region. In Uganda, we don't see the effect as yet on the locust, since it is just some weeks back, but it should be understood as part of many other crises that Uganda is living. One of those, of course, being one of the largest refugee hosting country in the world with almost 1.4 million refugees. So the impact of the locust can have a devastating effect on the host community. And having also pressure even more the people of Uganda and the government that is already having a lot of pressure with the refugee crisis.
Now, you also say that refugee response plans in countries such as Uganda are less than half funded, were less than half funded in 2019. So are there enough resources from organizations such as yours to help avert this looming crisis that you see coming?
No, it's not at all. It's an extremely underfunded humanitarian response in Uganda. In 2019, just 40% of the response plan was actually funded. And this, of course, gives massive effects on how the response is being carried out. And it has an effect on food security. And we already hear the large UN agencies, FAO, saying that they fear famine in the region, but also in Uganda it is of course important to beef up the funding in the humanitarian sector so that the effect of the locust and those crises doesn't create a catastrophe.
Now, as you mentioned, the FAO, the UN, is appealing for additional support to deal with this threat. I think about $62 million. Uganda as well has allocated about $4 million. It's also received some UN support worth about $1.3 million. What are your thoughts on the progress made so far in funding and dealing with this threat?
No, I think it is very good and should be appreciated, of course, the efforts that is done on the locust. It's very early and it can be much worse if it is not stopped, but it should be seen in the light of the humanitarian crisis and the underfunding of that crisis, and this needs to be addressed, otherwise the situation will deteriorate. Not only for the refugees, but definitely for the host community that actually is carrying the burden today a lot with regard to the humanitarian crisis in Uganda.
Well, given these funds, what are your views on the region's ability to contain the spread of these locusts and, of course, on the damage already caused to local farming communities?
No, I think it is well understood that it is difficult to contain this, and it has been in the region and escalating the last months into Uganda, into South Sudan the last weeks, and also into DR Congo. So it is very difficult to contain, and this region hosting almost 14 million displaced, of course, needs the attention now so that this doesn't escalate further.
Well, we do have to leave it there. Many thanks for your insights. That, of course, was Ulrika Blom. She's Uganda's country director for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Well, let's head into a short break now. Still to come. International financiers promise to help fight the coronavirus outbreak. And Australia's scientists battle to save the country's wildlife as we mark World Wildlife Day.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back. Now, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are ready to help member nations address the various challenges of the coronavirus outbreak. The two Washington-based lenders plan to offer a variety of services in their fight against the COVID-19 virus. That's including emergency financing and policy advice. They've also urged member nations to strengthen their health surveillance and response systems to contain the virus. The novel coronavirus has killed more than 3,000 people, the vast majority in mainland China. More than 88,000 cases have also been confirmed on every continent except Antarctica. Now, there has been a huge surge in online food orders since the coronavirus outbreak began. Many of the restaurants filling these orders are more used to working offline, but have been forced into the delivery business by the epidemic. Here's Zhang Xixuan with more.
It's just 10:30 in the morning, but the entrance to this hot pot restaurant in Pudong is already full of takeout packages. The restaurant reopened on February the 19th, but has kept its dining service shut, providing only delivery service.
We have 81 restaurants nationwide, but now only 20 are open, offering delivery service. Delivery income cannot offset all our losses on the dining business, but some individual restaurants are doing very well, with their food delivery revenue more than that from their dine-in business in the past.
This hot pot restaurant is now selling 115 kilograms of beef a day. In the past, it might have gotten 70 or 80 delivery orders a day, but now it's getting more than 200. The price per order is around 300 yuan. While some restaurants have seen a significant increase in their delivery orders since the outbreak of COVID-19, some are introducing the business model for the first time. Online food delivery platform Meituan Dianping says some 3,000 merchants have recently entered the market since the outbreak. They include high-end hotels. This hotel in Shanghai's Jing'an district has been offering meal deliveries online for the past week, charging an average of 70 yuan for each. Food and beverage sales would normally account for 45% of the hotel's revenue, but since the outbreak, they're down by 95%. Online sales cannot make up for all of that, but they do help ease the losses.
We see the trend is actually, especially for lunchtime, people look for something very nutritious, but more in a price range between 35 to 45 RMB. Outside catering is the margins are smaller, but we try to go for the volume. And as I say, it's also to bring back customer back in the future.
Knorr says the basic price of the lunch sets ranges from only 38 to 88 yuan to fit the budget of average office workers nearby.
Many restaurants around here are still closed, and the prices here are good. In the past, we would usually meet up at a hotel, so now we are booking their lunch together.
The restaurant business in China is gradually returning to normal, but most restaurants are still suspending dining business because of the coronavirus. The Shanghai government approves restaurants that want to resume operation and has so far given the go-ahead to 150 firms covering more than 3,000 individual outlets, allowing them to provide food delivery service. Zhang Shixuan, ICS for CGTN, Shanghai.
Well, let's shift focus now to the UK. The finalization of Brexit has brought unexpected challenges to many businesses in the country. Brexit is set to have cost the UK more than $256 billion in lost economic growth by the end of this year. Now, this is a figure that almost eclipses the total amount the country has paid into the EU budget over the past 47 years. Here's CGTN's Juliet Mann with the details.
From the kitchen counter to artisan on an industrial scale, this family-run confectionery firm makes 1 million meringues a day. They're stocked all over the UK, with a small customer base in Europe. But Brexit has them rethinking their expansion plans.
We will not be actively seeking European partners. We have growing to do. We've got a factory to fill. We've got overheads to cover with sales that come in. So we have to look where the easiest opportunities are for us right now. And that the easiest opportunity right now is not in Europe.
Clarity from the UK government on Brexit sticking points, from food labelling to tariffs and red tape, would keep them sweet.
This salted caramel meringue is a company bestseller, a big hit in Germany, the Netherlands and Northern Ireland, and now in the United States.
Okay, what other opportunities are there outside of Europe, which is where we started looking at China, we started looking at the US. We're looking to the Far East, so we're doing quite a lot in the Gulf, entry points. Kuwait, small market, but fantastic opportunities. Saudi, there's loads of landscape for us to grow in other parts of the world.
It's not just trade. In this Brexit transition phase, finding people with the right skill set is proving tricky.
So if you're a company and you're looking to expand business abroad, you need to help somebody to smooth the way when it comes to deal making. Those people that smooth the way are linguists.
In a business built on speaking more than one language, the UK seems less attractive for high-skilled employees.
The emotional response was they felt rejected and people were not coming in. This was very specifically something that we found with German native speakers, and Germans just simply stopped coming, actually. So the result was that those that did come were requiring and were demanding higher salaries. There was a scarcity as well. This was a problem. This is a problem for us. The only way to deal with this is to look at trading outside of the EU. So look at China, look at Japan, look at Korea. These are our next projects, basically.
Firms of all flavours feel it's crunch time for a trade deal with the EU to be wrapped up soon.
This showstopper meringue is made by hand, which makes it quite fragile, which is why it needs clever packaging. A little bit like the Brexit trade talks, handled with care.
If not, British exporters may find themselves dispatching to markets new.
Now, created by the UN, World Wildlife Day raises awareness and celebrates wildlife across the globe. It takes on special importance as Australia's scientists battle to save the country's wildlife, which of course was hit by unprecedented bushfires, which are believed to have killed more than 1 billion animals in the country. Here's Greg Navarro with the story.
Fire threatened a remote part of Victoria's Gippsland region, home to one of the few populations of the rare eastern bristlebird.
It was never going to get away from in front of a fire.
So scientists launched a rescue mission never tried here before. The goal was to rescue 15 of the tiny birds and bring them to the safety of the Melbourne Zoo.
Had we not done that, it was a perilous state.
The mission is just one of countless efforts to save wildlife injured and threatened by Australia's unprecedented bushfires.
We know that we're in a bad way at the moment with threatened species. We know that there are, of the 1,800 species on our threatened species list, over 300 of them were demonstrably impacted by these fires.
Some of those efforts are taking place at the country's major zoos, including the Melbourne Zoo, that were already focused on preserving endangered species, including the southern corroboree frog. Here, teams of wildlife specialists tended to animals injured by fire.
Hey, little guy.
Other efforts are taking place on a smaller scale. The kind of work that wildlife rehabilitators, including Lisa Palmer, will tell you is just as important.
So this little one's put on about 20 grams since I've had it.
Every morning, Palmer's routine on her suburban Melbourne property involves tending to dozens of injured and displaced animals, including the grey-headed flying fox and a ringtail possum.
We are seeing a huge number of these animals come into care because they're frankly starving.
Scientists say one of the reasons we may never know the full extent of the impact of the fires is that they didn't have a full knowledge the numbers of wildlife and in some cases entire species that lived there before.
University of Melbourne professor Brendan Wintle is the director of the National Environmental Science Program, a federally funded effort that includes the recovery of threatened species.
There's probably thousands and thousands of species on this continent about which we know nothing. And as you say, we could be losing those species before we even learnt they existed.
The numbers of animals lost by fire believed to be more than 1 billion, and the task of saving species further threatened is daunting. But Craig Whiteford, the general manager for threatened species at Zoos Victoria, says he and other scientists are guided by a simple approach.
Well, we've just simply got to believe that we can do something.
That includes, Whiteford says, already planning for the impacts from the country's next bushfire season. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Melbourne.
And moving on now, here's a quick look at how commodities performed today. Oil prices extending gains, with Brent crude climbing over 2% on expectations that central banks are likely to enact financial stimulus, which of course will offset the impact of the coronavirus. Also, OPEC is now mulling over a bigger output cut of possibly 1 million barrels per day. Meanwhile, gold prices also rising for a second straight session. Traders say gold is moving along with equities now as investors re-establish their positions. Platinum also rising as much as 1.5% today. Well, let's head into a quick break, still coming up. What may look like dirt to you transforms into an eco-friendly fashion statement in Nigeria. And Cape Town stays ahead of the game, turning chunks of data into better service delivery.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Now, an artist in Nigeria has figured out a way to raise awareness about the damage of plastic waste on our environment while breaking even in the world of fashion. He turns what may look like dirt to you into quirky and funky fashion items. CGTN's Terry Wangari has that story on Grassroots tonight.
This is Adeyemi Emmanuel. He's a visual artist from Lagos, Nigeria. Last year, he began collecting bits of discarded plastic and within days created a backpack. Seeing a way to raise environmental awareness in fashion-conscious Nigeria, in November he launched a line of bags, wallets and gift boxes called Eco.
I started experimenting with them. I just keyed my old mind into just creating something out of that waste. So I just played around with it and I just found myself making it as chips and laying them on the bags, and I felt it made sense and other people too should have it.
Plastic waste in the form of discarded bags, food and drink packaging is rampant in Lagos. Plastic bags are already banned elsewhere in Africa. Kenya has one of the toughest laws in the world, with the production or sale of plastic bags punishable by up to 4 years in prison or fines of $40,000. But in Nigeria, where the median age is 19 and the cultural influence of artists can be seen in the success of the Nollywood film industry and Afrobeats music scene, Emmanuel saw fashion as a way to make an impact.
In Nigeria here, it's a major challenge because everybody wake up in the morning, Monday morning especially, everybody are quick to just leave the house and you buy a bottle of Coke and your gala, you finish it and you don't want to keep dirt on you, throw it out. Most people do that because at times I do take the public transport and I just for me to see that action, I'm like, okay, more source of inspiration for like, let me just keep doing this thing. I think I'm doing the right thing.
Nigeria has several environmental laws that are simply not being enforced. So raising awareness via art and fashion is a step in the right direction.
These are some of the things that we find every time we have our beach cleanup every last Saturday of the month. Some of the aquatic animals have started to use it as a habitat.
Emmanuel hopes his products will fuel transformational conversations.
even the people that give these materials to me encourage me. They always want me to just come and pick it and just go away with it, because I'm relieving them of some few change that would save them and keep their business still going. Because they're just, at the end of the day, it's all joy. It's all joy. And even on my part, and I'm still making money from waste, come on. It's a big joy for me too still. This is one of the bags I've made.
The bags sell for between $22 to $83 via Emmanuel's Instagram account, where his creations are seen and shared by his 10,000 followers. Terry Wangari, CGTN.
Yeah.
Now, urban data and analytics is a hot trend for cities around the world, and it's easy to see why. As urban populations grow, city authorities need better data to deliver public services and plan for future demand for everything from transportation to water and sewer services. That's as well as green spaces. Let's wrap up with a look at how Cape Town's leveraging better analysis and more data sensors to improve service delivery.
From punch cards to large corporate IT systems, data is changing the way businesses approach their operational decision-making in just about every way. Now the city wants to follow suit and become a more data-driven region. And by joining the Global Future Cities program, it aims to better manage and solve complex city problems.
The city adopted a data strategy recently, which is to try and improve the way that we make strategic and operational decisions. And this involves departments across our organization as we try to take advantage of 21st century technologies and science and become a better and more effective service delivery organization.
The 3-year program will see the city foster a number of partnerships, including with the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which will provide technical assistance through the Global Future Cities program. Having big data analytics at the forefront of decision-making could see issues such as the costs of rates and services for the poor and wealthy managed much better.
We're talking about how the city manages and maintains its own data. A city accumulates huge amounts of data through its 4.5 million residents, businesses, and those that are traveling as tourists through the city. So, and part of this program is fundamentally how the city uses data to render better services to those that really need it, right, from a social perspective, but also growing economy.
With data expertise embedded deep within city structures, the possibilities of change for citizens are real, but there remains many challenges ahead, including housing and planning decisions that need to take into account historical social development issues. The city's new data strategy will certainly have to be innovative and progressive and redress some of the other wrongs of the past, including apartheid spatial planning, which has left a huge service delivery gap between more affluent areas and marginalized communities, and points to a far broader inequality issue that persists that the Global Future Cities program aims to solve. Travis Andrews, CGTN, Cape Town.
Well, before we go, a quick look at Africa's currencies today. South Africa's rand weakening. It gave back most of its gains from the previous session. Now, traders say the market was anxious ahead of the release of domestic data that was expected to show the economy had slipped into a recession. And of course, that's just what the data did. Kenya's shilling, on the other hand, weakening to its lowest level in 3 months after the central bank said it will buy $100 million from commercial banks every month between March and June in order to boost its reserves. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.